Hello, students. We're going to begin our look at Topic 8, which is Post-War United States, examining the United States in the decade and a half following World War II. And what we're looking at today is the containment policy, and U.S. foreign policy for the next several decades is going to be focused largely on two sort of things. One is the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as containment, which is a policy of trying to prevent the spread of communism to any more nations than it already existed in. After World War II, much of the area that had been conquered by Germany to its east had been reconquered by the Soviet Union, and the Red Army remained in control of those areas of Europe. Now, at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, Stalin had promised to hold free and fair elections in these countries, but as mentioned before, he is going to renege on this. He goes back on these. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and what would eventually become East Germany all became Soviet satellite states. And these were basically, ostensibly, independent nations with their own governments, but these were all communist governments set up by the Soviet Union and established as a way to sort of provide a buffer between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe. The Soviets were concerned about a resurgent Germany, so they wanted Germany to remain weakened. They'd fought 2 world wars against Germany, as well as they wanted some nations to sort of absorb any aggression that might come from Western Europe in their direction, so that they would have to go through these countries first. Fearing that the Soviets were trying to spread communism to Western Europe and Eastern Asia, President Truman starts to take action here. Now, prior to World War II, Stalin was seen as if not the same, a greater threat than Adolf Hitler. And so he was continued to be a threat after the Second World War. Truman issues what's called the Truman Doctrine. And in this, the United States promises aid to any nation struggling against communist movements. And this will be focused first on Greece and Turkey, where there were internal communist attempts to take control of the nations there. And Congress will give $400 million to those countries to try and help them fight off the communist overthrow. And this is really sort of the beginnings of what the containment policy will start to look like for the United States. Now, the Soviet Union, Stalin really spoke a lot about spreading communism, but it's kind of unclear how much he actually wanted to spread communism and how much he was more worried about maintaining his own power at home. Now, Germany will remain divided after World War II. If you recall, at the end of the war, the Soviets occupied the eastern portion of the country, and the United States, France, and Britain occupied the western portion of the country. It was divided into occupation zones. And Berlin, which is completely surrounded by the Soviet zone, was likewise divided into occupation zones. Well, the western countries, France, Britain, and the United States, will combine theirs into one, but the Soviets refuse to give up control of theirs. And so they start setting up a communist government in East Germany, and the Western powers start setting up a democratic one in the West. Stalin attempted to cut off West Berlin, from the rest of West Germany as a way of sort of trying to force the capitulation so that he could control the entirety of the city. It really kind of looked bad for them when you saw like the relative prosperity of West Berlin versus East Berlin under communism. So he cuts off all road and water traffic to West Berlin, but he couldn't he couldn't cut off air traffic going that way. And so the United States and Great Britain refitted their bombers and started running round-the-clock runs to go over West Berlin. You can see in a picture here, people awaiting this, they would airdrop with parachute supplies, food, medical supplies, clothing, toys, and all sorts of necessities to kind of help the people of West Berlin to continue fighting it out. Eventually, Stalin is going to give up and end the blockade. And this showed the dedication that the United States was willing to put forth to help its allies in Europe against communists. As noted in the last topic, the United States takes a much more active role internationally after World War II, and the containment policy also serves to encourage this internationalism, both in cooperation and intervention. Congress approved something called the Marshall Plan, named for the U.S. Secretary that would spend $13 billion rebuilding Western Europe. Now, some of this money was offered to the Eastern European countries, but they were now kind of under the control of the Soviet Union, and Stalin would not allow them to accept it. They rebuilt the economies of these countries, rebuilt their infrastructure, which really helped the United States economically because it's going to bolster international trade with those countries. But also, it ensured that these countries would rebuild as democracies and as allies of the United States. So some of the staunchest allies of the U.S. today are Western European countries like France and Germany that were rebuilt through the Marshall Plan. And this ensured that they would not fall under the sway of the Soviet Union or have maybe even an internal communist takeover through the government, because many of these countries, like France, for example, had a very strong communist party. And if capitalism and democracy seemed to be failing, that would have given them credence. So the Marshall Plan helped to sort of combat that. This map also shows the current countries in NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was founded by the United States, Canada, and several Western European countries as a military alliance to counter Soviet expansion. And this is one built on the idea of collective security. An attack on one is an attack on all. So the Soviet Union knows if they were to attempt to get aggressive with one of these NATO nations, they would be required to fight all of them, most importantly the United States, which was by now the most powerful nation in the world. And this helped to kind of keep that in check. Now, the need to defend each other has only been invoked once in NATO's history, and that was by the United States after the 9/11 attacks. But it did deter Soviet aggression. The Soviet Union will then form the Warsaw Pact, which is another mutual defense pact of Eastern European countries with the Soviet Union at the head, sort of as a way to counter this. The U.S. intervened in Korea. We'll get more into this in section or lesson 2. But the United States, in short, is going to lead UN forces to help the South Koreans fight against the North Korean communists who had invaded in an attempt to reunify the country under one communist nation. And we'll get back to that later. But this also is going to spark the creation of SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which is a similar military alliance to NATO, but it focuses on Southeast Asia, Oceania, and Australia. In 1949, the Soviet Union will be confirmed to have developed its own atomic bomb years ahead of where American scientists had estimated they would be at, and this sort of sets up the arms race that will dominate the second half of the 20th century between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, building more powerful and more advanced weapons over the course of that time. This picture here is from Bikini Atoll with one of the testing of the first hydrogen bombs that the United States developed in 1952. It is 1,000 times more powerful than the atom bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union will develop their own a year later. And this sets us up for what they refer to appropriately as MAD, mutually assured destruction. Both nations had enough firepower to obliterate each other many times over, so neither side dared to use them, and it kind of maintained a little bit of peace. Now, President Eisenhower will follow a little bit of a different policy of containment than Truman's, but he still focuses on containment. He's actually going to decrease and cut the military budget and instead focus on stockpiling nuclear weapons. The Eisenhower Doctrine, though, did say the United States would use force to help any nation threatened by communism, but in some situations, like with Hungary, where we see this picture here of an uprising after Stalin had died the United States did not act when the Soviet Union moved in to crush this uprising. They also didn't help Britain and France and Israel, who attempted to take the Suez Canal from Egypt, because Egypt was not a communist country, and the U.S. wasn't interested in sort of propping up this remnants of imperialism there. But Eisenhower did threaten the use of massive retaliation and talked about rolling back communism to liberate these other countries. It didn't really pan out that way oftentimes, though. Eisenhower did make big use of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, the spy agency developed in the United States after World War II, for secret operations, covert operations in the name of containment. The CIA under Eisenhower would support or sometimes create coups against governments, to overthrow governments that might be seen as sympathetic towards communism, although oftentimes what we'll see is the United States is mistaking nationalism in many of these countries that were formerly colonies for leanings towards communism. But an example, during Eisenhower's administration, they will overthrow the governments, the democratically elected government in Iran, as well as the government of Guatemala, to place in anti-communist governments instead. And notice they are, in this case, now we're focusing on preventing the spread of communism, not necessarily promoting the spread of democracy. Many of these governments that will come into power are not democratic, sometimes dictatorships, and oftentimes less democratic than the ones that we overthrew. But because they would be strong allies against communism, we chose them instead. The other thing that will dominate this part of the Cold War in a non-violent but seen by many as still threatening way was the space race, the race between the United States and the Soviet Union to explore space. And the opening shot was fired by the Soviet Union in 1957 with the launching of the satellite we see here, Sputnik 1, the first man-made satellite. Congress kind of flips out. What if they can put nukes up there? What if they can spy on us? All the possibilities, and also just the general fear that the United States was falling behind the Soviet Union. This rivalry between us will dominate many aspects of life. So Congress will spend $1 billion to support science education in public schools and in universities to try and encourage more Americans to become scientists. And we'll also see the creation of the National Aeronautics Space Administration, or NASA, to coordinate scientists and the military in an effort to win the space race to beat the communists there. Looking at your graphic organizer here, it's just a simple web. We have containment at the middle here. All of these are examples of actions the United States took in support of containment. So what I want you to do for each of these is tell me how each of them was supporting the containment policy. As an example, I give you the Marshall Plan here. The United States spent $13 billion rebuilding Europe, but we rebuilt it to be democratic nations and not communist nations. So this served to try and help contain the spread of communism in that way. I love you. Bye-bye.